Right, I'm going to get started now. So thank you for coming to this webinar firstly. My name is Rohan Howitt from the Department of History here at University of Sydney. I've broken this kind of session down into the 4 things that I thought would be most practically useful for you in kind of the next stage of your studies for modern history in the HSC. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is finding digital resources to kind of support your studies in modern history. The second thing I'll be talking about is source analysis and some skills to kind of build the way you analyze sources. And then I'm going to go into some kind of general study tips and finally some writing tips. And then we'll have time for some questions at the end if you have any. So one of the keys to doing really well in the HSC in modern history is having a really deep knowledge of relevant sources that you can apply to any of the syllabus dot points that you need to. So textbooks are a really great place to start, but the best way to get this kind of deep knowledge of sources is to find sources that interest you. I noticed also from the sign-up information that you provided that there are some Year 11s here. So I'm guessing that some of you will be in the process of or about to commence doing your historical investigations. And so this discussion of where to find good sources could also be really useful for that. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to run quickly through a few of these different types of sources and places to find them, focusing particularly on resources that are available online and for free. And what I will be doing also is putting together either as slides or possibly just as a PDF, a copy of this with links to all of the sources that I'm talking about, so you don't have to frenetically try and keep track of them. So just as a starting point, the University of Sydney Library has a really great guide to digital databases for history, broken down into primary and secondary sources and into different categories like Australian, European, American history. And other universities like Macquarie University have really good versions of this kind of database as well. So I'll be sending out some links to those kind of general databases. These are a few of the kind of select highlights from those. So you've probably come across Google Scholar before as a way to find kind of really good quality secondary sources. And if you have been playing around with it, you've probably encountered the frustrations that come with using Google Scholar, because very few of the sources that you will find on there you actually have access to. So these are just a few ways to get around that. And one is ANU Press, that's run by the Australian National University. So it's what's called an open access publisher. So it publishes academic books and articles that are available free to anyone. You can download ebooks, and it also digitizes a lot of old books. So just to give you one example of this, I know a few of you were doing the nuclear age as your change in the modern world study. And so if you're doing that and you want to expand your research and have a good secondary source that you can refer to in your responses, something that covers quite a lot of the dot points that you can apply anywhere in the exam, you could look at something like this book, Grappling with the H-Bomb by Nick McClellan, or this one on France in the South Pacific, and you can download individual chapters or the entire book just by using ANU ePress. There's also something which you might have come across called the Internet Archive, which runs a ebook lending service. So it's basically a digital version of a public library. And because of the closure of public libraries at the moment, they're running what they're calling the National Emergency Library, which has got rid of all waiting lists to access sources. So if you're trying to get hold of kind of good books on any sort of topics, they've got about 1.5 million books available for you to borrow as an ebook. And it's also worth thinking about state and national libraries in Australia and the various digital resources that they have. If you haven't already, I would highly recommend going to the National Library of Australia's website and getting a National Library card, because that then gives you access to all of the digital resources that it has. So it's quite similar to having access to a lot of these things through a university. And using Trove's book search, you can narrow down and find good quality books that are freely available online. So those are just kind of those gold standard secondary sources that will really help you with your studies. But what I'm going to really recommend, even more than that, is what we call outward-facing secondary sources. So outward-facing history is when historians write short articles for a public audience based on their research. And a lot of the time when you're using textbooks or even other readings that your teachers select for you, you'll be using sources that are maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe even older years old. And this kind of outward-facing history is a great way to get access to cutting-edge new scholarship in a really cheap, easy way. So you've probably come across The Conversation before. It's a website that is funded by universities to publish this kind of research. And it's really one of the best places to find this kind of history. And you can just search the website to see if there's anything related to the topics that you're doing. And I have included links to stuff like, here's the list of the dozen or so articles about Soviet history that these kind of things publish. In addition to The Conversation, there are kind of specialist magazines and websites dedicated to this, such as History Today and History Extra in the UK. I was looking at this earlier today, seeing what they had about Nazi Germany, for example, and History Today has published 1,500 articles on that. So you can find huge numbers of quite short, they're usually about 2,000, 3,000 words, articles that you can access that give you new scholarship on key topics and dot points that you can use to kind of incorporate into your notes and really show off the depth of your knowledge when it comes to the exams. Podcasts are also worth mentioning as another way you can access this kind of thing. And here's just a few of them, like the History Lab and History Listen. And again, I'll be sending through the links to this after today. And just quickly, you can also get access to a lot of really good quality primary sources for free online. Newspapers are one of the easiest ways. There are newspapers from pretty much any country available online. Some you have to pay for, but some like Trove and from Australia and the Chronicling America database are freely available. And it's worth thinking that, so for example, you might be doing the Russian Revolution, and so you want to find primary sources about that. You may not be able to find anything that you can read because it's in Russian from Russia, but a lot of newspapers from around the world had correspondents who were involved in these kind of events. So you can find primary sources in unlikely places. So you can look for things like accounts of life in Nazi Germany in Australian newspapers, for example. And there's also a lot of specialist private institutes that collect loads of material. And the example I've given here is the Hoover Institute from the University of Stanford in California, which collects vast quantities of Soviet material, including more than 30,000 Soviet-era posters that are digitized and available online. And it's also worth noting that the Internet Archive has published pretty much any out-of-copyright book from the early 20th century or the 19th century. So for a lot of your topics, you can find really good primary sources there. So they're the kind of key things. And again, you'll get access to these when I send through the slides. But I think the key point to make is that textbooks are a great starting point, but they're only going to take you so far when it comes to mastering the topics that you're studying. So you can do really well in your HSC just by getting a good textbook and doing any readings that your teacher sets you. But if you want to make your responses stand out, you need really good notes and a really detailed knowledge of your topic. And the best thing you can do is find extra sources on the things that interest you and think about how you can apply them to the different dot points. So moving on to analysing sources, which is one of the key skills that you're meant to learn in modern history. But there is a really common tendency when analysing sources to kind of reduce it to describing the source that you're meant to be analysing or identifying the problems with it, why it's biased. And these two things, these ideas of description and bias, are important parts of a source analysis, but they're only relatively small parts. So what I'm just going to do for the next few minutes is give a quick rundown of how to approach sources. And in the HSC, you will be analysing sources very quickly, and you'll likely be doing one of three things for them. So these three questions are all from the 2019 Modern History Part 1 HSC exam. So you might find yourself asked something like question 2 here, which is asking you to connect a specific syllabus dot point, in this case, Nazi ideology, to a specific source. So your job in that case is to analyze the source to work out what it reveals about that syllabus dot point. Another kind of question you'll be asked is this one, question 3 from last year's paper, which explicitly asks you to assess the value of these sources to an historian working on a particular topic. The other style of question you could encounter is one like this, question 4 from last year's paper, which asks you to incorporate evidence from a specific source in a longer response. So basically, all source analysis questions will come down to one of three things: looking for evidence of something specific, usually a syllabus dot point or part of a dot point, in a source, assessing the value or reliability of a specific source, or using a source as evidence for points you are making in a longer response. And regardless of which of these kinds of questions you're answering, or what kind of source it is you're analyzing, you can use the same set of tools to analyze that source. So there's lots of different ways to structure and frame this kind of analysis of a source, but I'm going to take you through what I think are the 6 key parts. So the first question you should be asking of any source you come across is it authentic? Is it what it purports to be? And these are just some of the sub-questions you can ask to answer this. In most cases, this is something you do really quickly because most sources you're going to encounter are authentic. But in some cases, something like provenance, how the source came to be where it is today, is a good way to knock out kind of the useless sources. So the really famous example of that would be the Hitler diaries, which were forged in Germany in the late 1970s and then published by a German newspaper and around the world in the early 1980s. And the fact they could only be traced back to the 1970s meant that they were not authentic. They were not actually Hitler's personal diaries. They were a fraud, and they were useless for historians trying to learn about Nazi Germany. But in most cases, you can ask these questions very quickly and move on. So then your next thing is, what is the source's content? And this is the really big one. So you're looking at, what does the text of the source describe? What does the image show? What is going on in this source? And also thinking about the kind of source it is. And by this, I don't just mean, is it a primary or secondary source? You need to be as specific as you can. You know, is it a letter? If so, who is it a letter from and to? Is it a legal document like a will? What kind of document is it? Is it a newspaper article? Then where is it published? What is the newspaper? Where does it fit into the newspaper? Is it on the back page or the front page? Being really specific about what that source actually is. And then thinking about things like the language of the source. Is it intimate, casual, formal, legalistic? If it's a visual source, how is it structured and framed? These are the kind of nitty-gritty details. And so if you were taking your time to analyze a source, you would make as detailed notes as you could on what the content of the source is. The next part, and this is really important and something that gets often overlooked when you're analyzing sources under pressure in the HSC, is what is the context of the source? For example, is it an extract from the source? Normally it will be. Or is it the entire source? Was it part of something bigger? Where does it come from? What was happening when it was created? And I think something, if you're going to kind of take away one key tip, it's that don't be afraid to use other sources to help you interpret this source. So think about what it is that you need to know to be able to analyze this source properly. So for example, if this is a law, if you have a law from Nazi Germany as your primary source in the HSC as source A, then what do you need to know to be able to interpret that properly? You need to know what laws came before it. You need to know what events were happening around this time. What was the law in response to? You know, which parliament was passing it, things like that. And you can also think about the purpose of the source. Was it intended to be kept private, like a letter? Was it intended to have a public audience? Was it meant to be temporary? Was it meant to be kept for posterity? All of these things go into your notes on the context of a source. And you also need to think about what influenced the author. Did the author have certain ideas? Did they have a reason to portray events in a certain way? And again, all of these details will be given to you, so you don't have to try and hurry to keep track of them. That brings us then to the idea of perspective. And so when you're talking about bias, there is a tendency to treat bias as a bad thing. But when we're talking about primary sources, bias is probably the most valuable thing in the source, because it's that which shows you a particular perspective. And then we can think about reliability. Did the author actually have access to the information they claim to have? Were they present of the events they're talking about? If it's a secondary source, do they provide references? Was the source written down during the event immediately afterwards? Was there a delay? Does that change what they were saying? Things like speeches. Is it the notes that the speaker had? If so, did they go off topic? If it's recorded by someone in the crowd, did they get it verbatim or did they miss key parts? Were they trying to summarize or were they trying to quote everything? How accurate are the quotes in the source? And then all of this is leading up to this idea of value. So all of what that is above, they are just tools to help you answer this question in bold, which is, what does the source reveal about the past? This is what I'm going to suggest to you for kind of working on your analysis of sources, is to practice using this framework or another framework that your teacher gives you to analyze primary and secondary sources. Just practice doing that, breaking them down, asking these questions and making notes on them. And then those questions that I posted, think about those 3 types of questions. What does the source reveal about something? Is that source useful for historians? What evidence does it provide for a kind of wider argument for an extended response? If you can practice using this framework to analyze sources and then applying them to those 3 types of questions, then by the time you get into your HSC exams, those source questions will not be any problem to you. You'll be able to answer them really quickly. So to just give you a quick example of what I mean, and I appreciate that I'm running out of time quite quickly. This is a source that has nothing to do with the HSC, but it does illustrate the ideas that I'm talking about. So this is a photograph taken by Frank Hurley, who was an Australian photographer who became famous for his work in Antarctica and then on the Western Front in the First World War. This photograph was taken as part of an Antarctic expedition when Frank Hurley was with an expedition led by Ernest Shackleton. It's a fairly famous story that their ship got crushed in the ice and they had to escape to this island in the Antarctic where 22 men were left behind and 6 men sailed a tiny boat across the most dangerous waters in the world to get help 1,300 kilometers away. And this photo supposedly shows the moment, according to Frank Hurley, when those 6 men returned to rescue them. So this is a kind of a photo of triumph. We can ask if the source is authentic, and the answer is yes. It was definitely taken in Antarctica in 1916, and then the originals were donated to the State Library of New South Wales. But there's a reason to be suspicious of this source, because Frank Hurley, the photographer, later got in trouble during the First World War for doctoring his photos, editing them, because he didn't believe photos should show exactly what happened. He believed photography was an art form and he needed to give people a feel for what it was like on the Western Front. So the photographer has a reputation for editing his photos, and that gives us reason to be suspicious. You can see the content of the photo. It shows the men on the beach in the Antarctic and a boat in the distance. But the context is really important. So we can use other sources to help us understand what's going on. And if you look at, for example, at the diaries of some of these men in the photo, it shows that when they were rescued, they only had 15 minutes to pack up all of their stuff and get out before ice cut them off, and they would have to spend a year there before they could be rescued. So it was a really chaotic scene, and there probably wasn't time for Frank Hurley to take this photo of the rescue boat coming. Instead, Frank Hurley's own diary shows that he did have plenty of notice, and he did take a photo of the time when the boat was leaving in April 1916. So by using other sources, we begin to get an idea that maybe this photo isn't what it purports to be. And then if you look at the negative of this photo, another kind of contextual factor, you can find that it was actually dated from April 1916, not August. So this photo is inauthentic and biased and problematic, but that does not affect its usefulness for historians. So it still shows Elephant Island in Antarctica. It still shows the conditions these men faced, the equipment they were wearing, and it shows the moment that Ernest Shackleton left to go and seek help. And the fact that it's not what Hurley said it was also makes it useful for historians, because it does show that the evacuation of the island was rushed and chaotic, and that Hurley didn't have time to photograph that scene, but that he was under commercial pressure to take a photo of that dramatic moment when they were rescued. So they faked it because a photo of the rescue was more valuable than a photo of the departure. And it also reveals something about Hurley and his idea that photos didn't need to be a documentary record, but rather an art form that gives a feeling for what the world was like. So then, to wrap up with some study tips just quickly. Building on my own experience, I did the Modern History HSC 10 years ago now. And so building on my own experience and things that I know other people have used very effectively, the best way to organize your study notes is as simple as it gets. It's breaking down your study notes by dot point, and then for each dot point of each syllabus study, have factual information to tell you what it was, what are the key events, specific examples for that dot point. So things like little anecdotes and stories, quotes, laws, events, people, those kind of really specific detail that you can then apply to a HSC response. And historians' views. So once you've read something like one of those books or a conversation article or something in History Today, write down what it is this historian thinks so that you can also add that level of detail into your response. You can use things like bolding, italics, underlines, different fonts and different colors. And I found color really useful as a way to organize these three different parts. So you've got your factual information, your specific example, and your historiography. And bolded names and events are particularly useful for really imprinting that stuff in your memory. The advice I would give you is to print your study notes to read them and then rewrite your notes by hand. This is the kind of thing you can do in the holidays as you're doing your kind of major study for your exams, because the brain is a really strange beast and it remembers things it reads in print better than it does things that are read on a screen. And it remembers things that you write by hand better than it does by typing. So the practice of having a good set of notes, reading them in print, writing them again, and even if you then don't look at them for another couple of weeks and then just quickly read them before your exams, you will be amazed how much you remember because of that process of writing them by hand. It also helps to build up your kind of writing stamina. And audio can be really useful for some people. So recording short bits of key information and notes as kind of mini podcasts for yourself to listen to can really break up the monotony of studying. So if you write up your notes and record them as you're preparing for your trial exams, you will then have audio available to listen to as these kind of little mini podcasts, especially for your syllabus dot points for the actual HSC. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, engaging with good history is a really important part of this. So textbooks are useful, but they're not normally really interesting, really good history. Podcasts like the History Listen and the History Lab, this kind of popular history stuff like The Conversation and History Today and History Extra, that's where you'll get that kind of good quality but really short and accessible history. And the other thing is, you will always find, history is meant to be fun. It's not meant to be just lists of dates and names. It's meant to be stories that reveal kind of how and why the world changes and why it stays the same. So you don't need to just kind of memorize facts and stuff. If you're reading generally related stories, it's probably the most valuable thing you can do, because stories are what will stick in your mind and give you the kind of deep knowledge and detail that you need. I should probably wrap up there because I am rapidly running out of time. Those are my key points, and I should see if anyone has questions. If anyone wants to know, I have a very basic writing tip which I can talk about if that's something you would be interested in.
I think so, Rohan. We're getting a lot of questions here from the attendees about exam strategies and so on, which might be something that you answer with your writing tips about.
Yeah.
Perhaps if I could read a couple out to you.
Yeah, sure.
So there are questions like, how much detail should you give for each source, and how long should you spend answering the question when you speak about each source? Are there key areas in the analysis that markers are looking for more than others?
Yeah, and I should say that the number one thing for developing this is to take the time to go to the NESA website, just Google New South Wales Modern History, and then go to the 2019 exam pack and download the marking guidelines and sample answers for the 2019 HSC and read that in detail, read it a few times, because that is where you will get the strongest possible answer of what people are looking for when they're marking your HSC. So in terms of writing, there's a really good strategy that is just the rule of 3. And it applies to pretty much any writing you will do from HSC exams upwards. So it basically means that if you have a question that asks you, a short answer question, sometimes it will say, give 3 reasons or give 4 reasons or examples. If it says that, do that. If it doesn't say how many, put 3 examples. If you're doing a slightly longer response, like a 6 or 7 mark response, give 3 examples. If you're doing a slightly longer one again, like a 12 mark short answer one in that part 1 of the HSC, 3 points is a really good way to structure it. And when you get to extended responses in parts 2, 3, and 4, for your depth studies rather than the core, that's when, if you're looking for a general way to structure your responses, a very short intro, a very short conclusion, and 3 paragraphs, each with a clear point. And if you need examples, 3 examples for each paragraph is the way to go. It's a general rule, it's not hard and fast, but it's a good indication of how much you should be doing. So you kind of scale it up for each of the next kind of longer responses. In terms of how much detail you should be putting, the amount of space given to you gives a really good indication. Don't overwrite those easy early marks. So if it says, give 2 examples, give 2 examples and move on. And if it's one of those longer ones of like 6 marks and you're not quite sure how much to do, put 3 examples and you'll cover it. But the best way you can kind of judge it, because everyone writes differently, and someone's kind of really detailed 3 examples will be different to someone's 3 general examples. So the best thing I can recommend you do is mark your own work by practicing, download the 2019 exam paper, practice answering those questions, and then go to the sample answers and the marking criteria and compare what you've done to what the sample answers are. If you're roughly the same length, then you've got a good amount of detail. If you've got way more than needed, then probably you need to spend that time elsewhere. And if you're really under what the sample answers are, then that's where you've got to think about, okay, I need to work on my knowledge of that point so I can add more detail into my response. So that's the kind of single biggest thing you can do to take responsibility for your own performance in the HSC, is to use that sample answers thing to give you an idea of where is my writing at.
Thanks, Rowan. A couple more questions here for you if you've got a couple more minutes. So one person would like to know if you have any tips to stop from over narrating and to spend more time actually analysing the question.
Yeah. I mean, one thing is not to be scared of over narrating, in that that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can get away with it more than you possibly think. The way around that is to make sure you have an argument in your head and you constantly refer back to it. So what I mean there is you have your little bit of planning time, and it's worth thinking when you have a question, and I'm thinking of extended responses here, so not the core, but parts 2, 3, and 4. So for your extended responses, how would you answer that question in one sentence? So even before you start writing, and some people like to plan, others don't, I would always recommend writing a little plan of, here's my argument, here's what point 1, point 2, point 3 will be. I would advise that. But if you have like a one sentence version of your argument of how you will answer that question, and you put that in your intro and your conclusion, and then at least once in each of your, I'm going to say 3 points, you might have more or less, but in general, 3 points for an extended response. In each of those points, you link back to what your argument is. That will ensure that you don't over narrate, and that your argument is clear to the marker, and that it's constantly in the front of their mind as they're marking it, which is what you want.
When analysing a source, should I stick to just that source or use retrospective knowledge, or should we just use the literal content of what's been given?
Depends a little bit on the question. So if it's a really small value question, like a 3-mark one, where, if it was a question here saying, name 3 things you can see in this source, just do that source. Do not bring anything extra into it. For those other kinds of questions, so I'm thinking like this one here, 3 marks, question 2, what does source A reflect Nazi ideology about the role of women? Use your own knowledge to look for stuff in that source, so you know that, what Nazi ideology is, and that this source is from, say, 1935, what's going on in 1935, but don't write about other sources. For these longer kinds of ones, absolutely. Having that wider knowledge of other sources, and especially of context, is what will get you those really top level marks. And particularly for the 12-mark ones, or 10 or 12 marks they can be, where you're bringing in extra sources and using that to contextualize your knowledge of the sources they give you. That's the secret to the really, really strong responses.
Thanks, Rowan. Some questions here about essay structure. So would you recommend a particular structure? Do you think it's recommended to try and memorize your essays or to use essay plans as part of your preparation?
Yeah, so I don't think memorizing an essay is useful, and I would never recommend it to anyone. My advice is don't spend your time trying to memorize essays. Practice essays are good, but your notes are going to be your best. Your time will be best spent investing in making your notes the best quality that they are. So if you write down what I was suggesting about a kind of basic account of the key information related to each dot point, some specific examples that you could apply to any question about that dot point, because remember that any dot point can form the basis of a question. And when they're writing the HSC exams, the exam writers have the syllabus there, and they look at what can I ask about that dot point. So that's the way to structure your notes. Have that key information about what happened, what are some specific examples, quotes, laws, events, people, specific stuff like that. And what are some sources, some historians' ideas, or some really notable primary sources that I can refer to. Practice doing that, and then you can get your teacher to create some questions based on the syllabus points. You can practice creating your own questions, which if you're comfortable doing that, I think is a really good idea. Think about what are the kinds of questions they would ask, and do the sample papers and the practice papers and the old papers to look at, you know, what are the kind of responses, and then practice writing that. But trust that you will remember enough stuff to be able to write a response on the spot. Having essay plans can be really useful. So if you practice writing out little things of, if this is the question, I will talk about these 3 things. That's a good thing to do to prepare. But kind of writing an essay, a perfect essay, and then reading it again and again and again is not going to be anywhere near as useful as working on a really good set of study notes and then printing them and reading them and then writing them out by hand and then reading them again. That really is the kind of single best thing you can do to make sure you have a deep knowledge that you can apply to any question that comes up, rather than needing certain questions to go your way. It's a much safer kind of strategy to prepare your writing.
Thanks, Rohan. I know we're a little bit over time, so perhaps just one more and then we'll need to wrap up. There's a question here about if you have any tips to effectively integrate historiography with evidence in our essay responses.
It's a tricky one to answer in general terms. The way I guess I would suggest to do it is when you're making notes, think about what do historians say about particular events and themes. So if you're talking about Hitler and Hitler's ideology and Nazi ideology, then you might look at, okay, here's what Ian Kershaw says about this. Here's what Richard J. Evans says about this. And then you can apply that when you're structuring your response. You can just kind of weave it in and say, there's some debate about what this aspect of Nazi ideology actually was. You know, Kershaw says this, whereas Evans says this. That's kind of the best moment to drop historiography into a response, is where there is some level of debate or contestability. And particularly if you can apply that to sources, that's the kind of moment to deploy it. Use it sparingly. Don't feel like everything needs to have an historian mentioned. It's something great for extended responses and will help you get those really top marks in extended responses, but it's not necessary. And it is possible to do really, really well and get a band 6 without having much historiography in your essay at all. So it's really useful, and I would advise you to have a bit of a knowledge of it, but you don't need to do it in everything. And the time to kind of do it is where what you're talking about, the point you're talking about, has some area of debate between historians that you've looked at, particularly if you find kind of newer scholarship that is challenging older ideas. That can be a really good moment. And that's one of the reasons I recommend that outward facing history material. And that's something that I know I relied a lot on when I was doing the HSC, was finding really new scholarship at places like History Extra and thinking about how they are challenging older ideas. And then when those specific examples came up in the exam, I could talk about how, you know, there's this new revisionist school challenging this idea. In my case, it was about World War I and the Schlieffen Plan. Was the kind of specific example I got from that. But any area of debate is the way to go.